Continuing discussion of Sri Vishnu Sahasranama, name 897, Sanat, in the course of discussing which, or mainly I've been discussing how Vishnu, God, is time, and if Krishna grants me sufficient time, I'll give a few more talks, and I hope at the end of all these talks, those of you who kindly give your time to listen to all of them may have a better understanding of time as it's understood in the Vedic, Vaishnava perspective, and I've thrown in some Western philosophical and scientific perspectives. And the subject of today's talk is biblical perspectives on the nature and effects of time. More on the effects of time. Why am I bringing in the Bible here? Well, the Bible is also centered on the topic of God, and philosophers throughout time have ruminated on the nature of God, the nature of time. Vaishnavas, those who accept Srimad Bhagavatam, accept the Srimad Bhagavatam as topmost evidence regarding God, the Supreme. But it's not that others in other climes and other times have not had insights into God and time. I'm particularly picking up on this subject because I read a book called Vanity Karma by my godbrother and friend. I count myself fortunate to have such an exalted friend, Jayadvaita Swami. The title of the book is Vanity Karma. Can't understand what the title of the book means unless you read the book. When I saw the book is a discussion of a section from the Bible, I wasn't so enthusiastic to read it because although undoubtedly the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible, which speaks principally to the Jews, and the Christian Bible, which speaks to Christians, has had a tremendous effect for thousands of years in influencing people toward God consciousness. I personally never found the concept of God therein to be very appealing. Now that's a very big subject, and you could say that's subjective, but I personally find it much more satisfying. The descriptions of God, the understanding of God given within the Vedic literature, especially in the Srimad Bhagavatam, and masterfully presented to us by His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. But I thought if it's a book written by Jayadvaita Swami, well, must have some depth. And indeed, the part of the Bible which he picked up is a highly philosophical part, which shows that throughout history there have been people who are not simply concerned with eating, sleeping, mating, and defending, and the struggle for existence, but who think on a deeper level. And particularly in this book, Jayadvaita Swami analyzed the section of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, called Ecclesiastes, and the unresolved philosophical issues in there. Jayadvaita Swami, who grew up with this, being raised in a Jewish family, he describes how he found the answers to the unanswered questions that Ecclesiastes raises, he found the answers in the teachings of Srila Prabhupada, which are the teachings of the Gauriya Vaishnava Parampara. A little background about this section of the Bible called Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes. It's spoken by Kohelet, one thing is scholars who typically, as scholars, na savrishya yasya matang na bhinnam, scholars typically disagree about everything, and it's especially true about Ecclesiastes. It appears to be spoken by a king called Kohelet, but they don't even agree on all of this. They can't agree, the scholars can't agree on whether the overall message of Kohelet is very positive or whether it's very negative, pessimistic. They can't find an overall pattern or coherence in it, although it is deeply reflective. At the same time, it's not totally incoherent. It appears to contradict itself. Even though it's a short work, it seems to contradict itself in places. So although there are many insights, it may also appear to be confusing. What it's doing in the Bible at all, seeing as it goes to go against the overall message of the Bible, which is faith in an all-good God, whereas Kohelet seems to, in much of his writings, which have come to be known as the book of Ecclesiastes, if at all he wrote it, if at all there was anyone called Kohelet. So what's it doing in there at all? It seems to be heterodox. But maybe it's orthodox, some scholars say. So there are so many things. Kohelet is presented or presents himself as a king. He's within the scope of kingship. He's seen everything, been everywhere, done everything. And he concludes that nothing is ultimately reliable except death, which levels everything. I'm going to read the translation given by Jayaveda Swami, who took it from other translations, about time, because after all our subject here is time. And it is deeply reflective and insightful. So please listen, and then we'll go through a little bit of Jayaveda Swami's commentary on that. I'll paraphrase that. Okay, this is the third chapter of Ecclesiastes. The depth, you'll immediately appreciate the depth of this. This is not someone who's just passing time talking something for the sake of talking it, but it's the utterances of a deeply reflective person. Ecclesiastes 3. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. What does that mean? Well, that is unpacked in the next few lines. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. This particular duet, if you want to, is commented upon by Jayaveda Swami, saying that the previous commentators, and there is of course a huge school of biblical commentary going back centuries, and it's still a live, active school. Commentators have had a little trouble with this one. A time to weep and a time to laugh, well, that's fairly understandable, but a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, not so easy to understand. Kohelet continues, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow. Sow here is spelled S-E-W. So here rend means to break apart, and a time to sow, which is redolent of what's already been stated, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. Who can learn when to keep quiet and when to speak is a wise person. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Okay, that's a short extract from Ecclesiastes. And then Jayadvaita Swami comments. I'm going to read and paraphrase. He says, why is there time at all? That's the first question. Why is there time at all? In the abstract, time is that continuous force that moves all events through the sequences of past, present, and future. And of course, in the series of these talks, I've discussed how philosophers have negated the very existence of time because the past doesn't exist, the future doesn't exist, and if we try to imagine what the present exists, it's already gone, so it also doesn't exist. There's nothing new, by the way. And even in the history of the world, even though St. Augustine, who's quite ancient from the 21st century perspective, but this was already discussed. Similar discussions in ancient Sankhya philosophy of ancient India. Time can mean, as Jayadvaita Swami continues, time can mean a suitable time, a time when something is meant to happen, whether it's once, like the day in our childhood when we first went to school, the very day when I first went to school. I can't remember it in my own case. Seem to remember I never liked it, but don't remember exactly. Or there can be something you do repeatedly, like each day we start the day going to work at a particular time. Or in our case, we go to Mangalati at a particular time. So in one sense, we can say philosophically time doesn't exist because the past doesn't exist, the future doesn't exist. We can't get a hold of the present because as soon as you try to think of the present, it's already gone. So time doesn't exist. But then, suitable time for various actions. The first time I went to school, the time of day at which I rise every morning and go to Mangalarti. These events, these actions couldn't take place if there wasn't time. So philosophically we'd say that time doesn't exist. On the other hand, nothing can exist without time. Well, you could say perhaps that things could exist. The only thing is nothing could move, and you couldn't even think about anything, because as soon as you think, that's also a progression of thoughts in time, and there you are, there's time again. Time, silent, unceasing, all-powerful, under whose control all events unfold. Under whose control? Yes, we are controlled by time. We are controlled by time. It's not simply something, some mysterious dimension in which things happen and we do things, or we have the illusion of doing things. But from one perspective, we are controlled by time, because we have to die, which is an event in time. It is non-negotiable. It is affected by time. So we are controlled by time. No time, and there is nothing. Because even if we say, okay, let's just freeze everything. But how did all those forms that are there even come into being? It's just simply inconceivable, unimaginable that time could stop. You could put water on the fire to boil, but then if time stops, the water will never boil. There'll be no moments, hours, days, weeks, fortnights, months, years, seasons. Lifespan would have no meaning. Civilization would have no meaning, because civilizations arise and fall within time. We take it for granted, yet time orchestrates, defines, and circumscribes everything in our lives at every moment. And what is it? Well, it just is. And we can't say much more about that unless we go to the Vedic knowledge. But from our subjective, or even if we try to understand objectively, and yeah, you can say E equals mc squared. You can say that. That's Einstein's formula, right? I just heard one major physicist on a YouTube talk saying that actually this wasn't formulated. This formula wasn't formulated by Einstein. You can find it in research papers prior to that of Einstein, before Einstein was even born. So anyway, you can say E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, but that doesn't really help us to understand the time that we live in. And from a standpoint of physics, you can say that, and it might seem to make sense mathematically, although it has nothing to correlate with our factual experience of time. Speed of light, that means time is involved in that equation. And then there we have time, space, it's one entity. Yeah, you can say like that, but it's physics and mathematics gone off the edge of reality. You may think you can map everything with mathematics and say space and time are ultimately one thing. We got the math to prove it, but factual experience is something quite different, including for Einstein and including for every physicist. And if Einstein hadn't treated space and time as differently, he couldn't have written that formula or explained it, because it requires to be done within space and within time, not as if it's all one merged entity. Anyway, I digress from Kohelet and Ecclesiastes and Jayaveda Swami. So what is time? What is time? It always has been. Why? Where did time come from in the first place? Well, they say Big Bang, don't they? There was no time before. And then there was Big Bang and then time began. But why? And then how? And how could time have arisen without time in which to arise? If there's a time before time, and then time comes into being, but how can time come into being? Because as soon as time comes into being, then time is there. And there must have been a time when it came into being. And then if you say there's no time previous to time, then there's pre-time time, which is also kind of time. Then you get stuck in philosophical head spinners. What can we say about time? We can use some big words: irreducible, inconceivable, which just means we haven't got a clue what it's all about. Even after studying and philosophizing, and I'm not making an anti-intellectual jab at philosophers and scientists, but their understanding of time, although in one sense or maybe in several senses it is more than that of the layman, but still they're far, far, far away from understanding what is time. It's just like I may be sitting here on a hill in Tamil Nadu. I'm a long way from New York City. And someone who's at the bottom of the hill, in a village at the bottom of the hill, is closer to New York City. But they're still a long, long, long way away. So, in the same way, philosophers and scientists on this question of time, they may make progress. There's some kind of progress into mapping it or trying to see what its effects are. And we can give them all credit for their endeavors, but we're still a long way from understanding, unless we go to the Vedas. Veda means knowledge. However much we speculate, we can't understand what it is, although we can understand. For as Kohelet says, there is a time to be born and a time to die. We should think about that. And what should we do in between? Time seems to be limitless, all-pervading, to have no origin beyond itself. And thus, in that sense, minimally in this sense, we should accept the existence of God. We can at least accept time is God. In the matter that, okay, you may be agnostic. You don't believe, you don't know. We don't know whether God exists. We don't know if God doesn't exist. Let's be agnostic. God means what? Supreme being, supreme controller, supreme absolute, beginning and beginningless and endless, the Alpha and the Omega, all powerful, all pervading. But there you go. Time fits all those epithets. Time is supreme over all of us. We can't escape the influence of time. Beginningless and endless, all powerful. All powerful, you may say, well, it's not all powerful. I have enough power of my own. But we are powerless to act outside the jurisdiction of time. So in that sense, it's all powerful and all pervading. Time is everywhere, in the macrocosm, the microcosm. So, there we go. We may be agnostic, but we are controlled by time. As Srila Prabhupada used to say, we may think ourselves independent, but we are controlled by forces which are beyond our power to defy. We have to grow old. We have to die. There's nothing anyone can do to stop that. There's no drug to stop it. There's no weapon to stop it. There's no yoga practice to stop the body dying. By yoga practice, it is possible to fantastically extend the lifespan, but we cannot stop death. So we are all controlled by time. According to our karmic destiny, We may be poor and suddenly overnight we become rich. According to our karmic destiny, we may be rich and suddenly overnight we're poor. Everything acts within the purview of time, which is inextricably interlinked with destiny, as has been discussed in previous talks in this series. Now, this isn't the idea of God that we get from the Bible, the God who speaks to Moses, sits in heaven on a throne. Yet time, for us, we have to admit, we're under the control of time. We have to submit. We can argue about it and say, no, I don't submit to time, but we have to submit to time, willingly or unwillingly. And then we find in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, who presents himself in the Bhagavad Gita as God, the Supreme Being. And of course, any idiot can present himself as God or the Supreme Being, but Bhagavad Gita is not just the ramblings of some idiot, but it is the disquisition of that person who is accepted in Vedic culture throughout the eons, and we learn from the Vedic literature, not only on this planet, but on higher planets also. Young Brahma, Rudra, Maruta, Young Brahma, Varunendra, Rudra, Maruta, Stunvanti, Divyai, Stavai. All the beings in the higher worlds, they accept Krishna as supreme. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna presents himself as supreme. And in the Bhagavad Gita, although it's mostly a conversation, mostly Krishna speaking, on the subject of transcendental knowledge, the nature of the soul, the nature of God himself, how this material nature works under the direction of Krishna, all these topics are taken up. And in the 11th of the 18th chapters, we have a spectacular depiction of Krishna's universal form, in which he shows himself to be God inasmuch as he shows his powers as manifested in this material world in multiple forms, and particularly Arjuna sees in that universal form destruction. And Arjuna, becoming bewildered, asks Krishna, he knows Krishna as his friend, his lifelong friend, but he asks Krishna, who are you? He's never seen this aspect of Krishna. And Krishna answers, and we've been through this in a previous talk in this series, Kalosmi, Kalaha, time, Asmi, I am. Kala comes from Kala, which means that which brings into fruition, that which makes move. So, Kalosmi, I am time, Krishna says. There's that wonderful form, having limitless arms and legs and faces, dazzling like thousands of sun, filling the earth and sky in all direction, all planets, rivers, mountains, seas, all the people, all the creatures and all the creations. And how is it all summed up? Kalosmi. I am time. Arjuna sees the blazing mouths of the universal form and all creatures entering into those mouths, wave upon wave, rushing to destruction like moths into fire. I am time, and I have come to destroy all. Krishna soon at Arjuna's request, he stops showing that terrible form and shows his usual benign, beautiful, friendly form. So time is only an aspect of God. His most congenial form is the form of love, of beauty, the supreme master, the supreme parent, the supreme friend, the supreme lover, the supreme child, the supreme lovable person. But at the same time, that aspect of time, we're discussing the aspect of time, that in this material world, that impersonal aspect of God as time is all controlling. So we may not believe in a personal God, that's our misfortune if we don't, but the impersonal controller, the unseen controller, time, the creates and destroys. There's a time to be born and a time to die, Kohelet says. There's a time to rend, to break apart, and a time to sew, to bring together. In Gita, Krishna says, Grasishnu Prabhavishnu cha. The Supreme Lord devours everything and again brings everything into being. So these questions, is everything predetermined? How much are we free? These are the kind of questions which philosophers have wrangled with since time immemorial and continue to do so. We may adopt various outlooks on all these philosophical questions, but one thing we shouldn't deny, or we should come, however philosophical and speculative we may be, we should see the fact that we are controlled by time. Every moment, everything we do. See, just move your finger like that. What's going on? What's going on? You can say, well, I'm moving my fingers. What's going on? What is going on means time is moving with every breath. You just do that. Just do that. And a short span of my life has gone away. That time has gone. Go like that. Time has gone away. You may say, well, it's just a couple of seconds. Yep. Second by second, our life is slipping away. That's why, in one sense, we can see that this material existence is illusory, because real means that which is eternal, with that which is absolute is eternal. It's not subject to destruction, but everything in this world is subject to destruction. That's why time we can call the silent killer. The silent killer, I recently saw there was wandering around on the Amazon books department. I saw there's a book called The Silent Killer, referring to mental states. So many people in the Western world especially have mental disturbances such as anxieties, depression, excessive suffering from excessive stress, mood swings. There are so many psychological disorders, and the subject of this book, The Silent Killer, is that it kills you while you're living. You're alive, but your life is being destroyed by these mental imbalances. So the silent killer. In the past, I've come across some people say salt is a silent killer. So many people physically brings on death by eating too much salt. Well, that's if you have high BP. Sugar is a silent killer. Some people pronounce that milk is a silent killer. They're saying it's so bad for health, and if you take salt or sugar, you keep on taking it, you don't see it, but it's killing you, it's destroying the body. Jack the Ripper, you may or may not have heard of such a person. Jack the Ripper was a silent killer. So there are so many silent killers. It's a chilling proposition, a silent killer. If someone comes in with a big gun and makes a big noise and kills, well, that's disturbing, but at least you can recognize he's the baddie, he's killing us. But then a silent killer, we can't even see it, we can't even recognize it as killing so many people. The most pernicious silent killer of all is time. But we don't take time to be a killer. We just say, well, everyone dies, that's natural. But then why don't we want to? Why is it that we don't want to die? We resist that because we are eternal. So, time is, in this material sphere, the eternal factor in which everything works, destroys everything. The philosophical search in Vedanta is to go beyond time, to understand time being supreme is an aspect of the supreme controller. I've discussed much about this. There's more to discuss in upcoming talks. I'm just going to read again that little section from Ecclesiastes because it's worth putting in a little time just to think about it and to be grateful that Srila Prabhupada has given us the knowledge which even great philosophers of the past and present grappled with such questions, very seriously grappled, understanding them to be important, but couldn't come to a conclusion. Whereas we are so fortunate to have the knowledge by which we can understand the nature of time in this material world, how to go beyond time to the spiritual world, to Krishna. That's also to be discussed in an upcoming talk in this series. Let's read again from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to harvest. Well, not necessarily harvest, just like in the field next year is tomato plant. So it's not that you harvest everything at once, like with wheat or rice, or in the field it also is tapioca plant. So you harvest it all at once. But with tomatoes, some come ripe, and on the same plant, one or two may be ripe, another 2, 3 are semi-ripe. So you don't just, you take it little bit by little bit. Anyway, that's off the topic. A time to kill. Yes, this is the material world, and there is a time to kill also. Unless you're a Jain, you try not to kill. But Kohelet, as a king, he knew that sometimes you have to kill. The politicians of this world, the leaders of countries, especially the major countries of this world, have been directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of others. It's a political necessity. That's controversial. A time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyo cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Dante nidhaya churnakam padayo nipata kritvacha kakushatam etad aham bravimi. Hey sadhava sakala eva vihaya durad gauranga chandra charne kuruta anuragaha. Parivadatu jano yatha tata va nanumukaro navayang vicharayamaha. Hari rasa madira madati mata bhuvi vilotama natama nirvishama. Ahaprirang natavaravapu karnayo karnikaram bibradvasa kanaka kapisham vaijayantim jamalam randhran veno adhara sudaya purayan gopa vrindayar vrindaranyam svapadaramanam pravishad gita kirtihi Shri Radhaya pranaya mahima kidrisho vanayaya vasvadyo yanadbhuta madhurima kidrisho vamadiyaha Saukyang chasya madhanubhavata kidrisham veti lobhat tadbhavardya samajani shatchi garbha sindhu harinduhu. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama.